Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. The Independent Permanent Human Rights Commission of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation has roundly condemned and rejected the Indian government's illegal notification to change the domicile law in Indian-occupied and illegally annexed Jammu and Kashmir. The IPHRC resolution reads, the Independent Permanent Human Rights Commission of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation strongly condemns and categorically rejects the Indian government's recently introduced Jammu and Kashmir Grant of Domicile Certificate Procedure Rules 2020, which spells out new domicile rules causing demographic flooding of non-natives in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir. While the world is striving to fight a global pandemic of COVID-19, India has mischievously used the opportunity to illegally alter the demographic composition of Muslim majority in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir. However, as in the past, the people of Kashmir have squarely denounced this law as yet another illegal move and expressed their resolve to stand firm against the tyranny of Indian occupation, unquote. Pakistan has welcomed the IPHRC resolution. The Indian move to redefine domicile rules to alter the Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir demographic is settlement colonialism against OIC UNSC resolutions, Fourth Geneva Convention, and international humanitarian laws. Meanwhile, terrorist attacks in Balochistan have increased, as has Indian military activity in occupied and annexed Kashmir. Pakistan's Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi has said that he will write a letter to the UNSC president apprising him of the situation. Pakistan fears that India is preparing grounds for a possible military ingress by conducting a false flag operation. Indian intelligence is also sponsoring terrorist groups in Balochistan. The situation in the Kashmir Valley remains tense following a gun battle between occupation forces and his freedom fighter and his aide. The 12-hour gun battle was fought in Srinagar's old quarters, a densely populated area. Junaid Ashraf Sarai, a commander of Kashmir's largest freedom-fighting group, Hizbul Mujahideen, and his aide were martyred while 4 occupation troops were injured. Occupation forces also destroyed 5 houses and severely damaged 10 other houses in the area. Destruction of property has now become a standard practice by Indian occupation forces. Sources say the tactic is straight out of Israel's playbook. Israeli occupation forces regularly destroy Palestinian properties and fruit orchards. Sarai was a business management graduate but joined the ranks of freedom fighters in early 2018. Protests broke out after the gun battle, and Srinagar, the summer capital of Jammu and Kashmir, remains tense. To discuss the situation, we are joined by Air Marshal Shahzad Chaudhry and Ambassador Munir Akram, who is Pakistan's permanent representative to the United Nations. Let me begin with Ambassador Akram here. Ambassador Akram, these are issues, destruction of houses, sending civilians in to probe the area, using civilians to plant explosives, to destroy the houses, and to send civilians to actually look out for dead bodies. All of these actions are in complete violation of international law. Is the United Nations cognizant of what is going on?
Yes, I believe that the United Nations is fully aware of the situation and the Indian actions in Jammu and Kashmir. The High Commissioner for Human Rights is cognizant and has been apprised by our mission in Geneva about the situation. We have on our part here kept the United Nations apprised also of developments, and as you mentioned, the Foreign Minister will be writing another letter to the Security Council. He will also be speaking to the Secretary General. So we are keeping the international community apprised of the situation. The question, of course, is what action can be taken. These, as you know, are difficult times with the attention focused on the COVID crisis, the tensions between the great powers, and especially in the Security Council. So it is a challenging situation, and India is taking advantage of this challenging situation to implement its oppressive policies in occupied Kashmir.
So when on August last year, Jammu and Kashmir was illegally annexed, one of the things that Pakistan constantly said, and so did the Kashmiris, that this move is a precursor to illegal settlements of non-Kashmiris so that the demographic balance could be shifted. Now, this domicile law is a very clear indication of that. Is this something that we need to press very hard? I perfectly understand the situation at the United Nations, but these are things that need to be put on record. And perhaps if you would also tell our viewers, what possible steps could Pakistan take in order to not just press this point, but also to put it on the agenda?
Well, as you know, the Kashmir issue is on the agenda of the Security Council and has been on the agenda since 1947. So the issue has raised and can be raised under that item. Security Council, of course, works on the basis of rules where certain powers have got the ability to block things. But Pakistan has pressed its position. What is important to recall is that the Security Council has already declared in previous resolutions that any unilateral measures taken by any of the parties to change the status of the disputed territory of Jammu and Kashmir are null and void. Therefore, under international law, the steps taken by India are already taken as null and void by the international community. And that is a point we will keep pressing, that these domicile laws, and indeed all the measures taken since August 5, all of them are illegal and null and void in international law. That is a position that has been taken. Of course, the problem is that the Indians are in physical control and are implementing their policies, and the international community has to reach a decision as to how it will respond to these measures. We have advocated certain steps. It is, of course, a question of getting the international community to take action on the proposals.
Okay, let me pull in Shehzad Chaudhry here. Marshal Chaudhry, there are rules and there are regulations. Fine, all these steps would be considered as void ab initio. But here's the thing. Strong states, we've seen this with Israel, for instance, or their strong backers, India could just simply cock a snook at the international community and say, well, you know, you can do whatever you want. As far as we are concerned, this is our internal issue, and we are going to deal with it in terms of our own constitution and our own laws. Now, that's the position that they're taking. In which case, the question then is, how far can we rely on the UN for mere condemnations?
I think we live in three different worlds. One is the world of the United Nations, where obviously we follow the statutes and we follow the legal proceedings and processes and hope that the international community will wake up to what is happening in Kashmir and do something about it. Just recently, the Security Council met, I think under the pressing situation of the COVID-19, to delegitimize any conflict, or essentially to bring ceasefire to all conflicts in the world for a period of time. Probably it was about 6 months to maybe 9 months. The United States vetoed that particular thing. Not only that, the United States Indo-Pacific Command actually launched an operation inside Venezuela, which is a sovereign country. So while the COVID was on, within the US and of course Venezuela and other places. So that is as far as the international community goes. And I understand and appreciate the fact that we still must stick to what is legal and what is procedurally right. And that is one plank of our policy that we have to live with. The second plank of our policy, which has perhaps gone unnoticed, is the present situation of the Simla Accord. Now, India having done everything that it has done to annex Kashmir, we still somehow hold on to the Simla Accord. But the Simla Accord has been unilaterally, I think, destroyed by India by doing what it did, and in fact, defying what the Simla Accord had said, that there can be no unilateral change to the line of control in 1972 when it was signed. So that, again, is lying unattended. And the third world is the real world on the ground as far as the Kashmiris are concerned. Now, the difficulties for Mr. Modi may be many, including the fact that Kashmir, what he tried in Kashmir, or what he has done with Kashmir, hasn't really settled down. There continues to be a simmer of, obviously, a reaction. And you've seen this since the last 8-9 months, since 5th August, in fact. And so this has come about, and this is going to continue because the Kashmiris have invested considerably and a lot of their life and treasure into this and time into this. So that's not going to go away. So India, I think, is not only restricting itself to Kashmir and taking care of what is happening there, or controlling or suppressing or oppressing the Kashmiris, but I think it may like to do something more and beyond this to try and distract world attention as well as internal attention or failure towards its failures on many counts. So I think those are the three words, and I don't know which one of those will actually come through or come true. And however, we've got to be ready for all of this. But I think the missing link here is the Simla Accord that we somehow still hold on to in Pakistan, despite the fact that the LOC per that is no more the LOC.
Okay, that's something that we have earlier discussed on this program, especially post-August 5th annexation, and how does that impact, or how did it impact the Shimla Agreement. But let me take this question to Ambassador Akram here. Ambassador Akram, how should we look at the Shimla Agreement post-August 5th? Because if we accept AVM Shehzad Chaudhry's argument, which is a very strong argument, that Shimla Agreement basically precluded either side from changing the situation unilaterally, and India has done that. In which case, we are also saying that the line of control goes back to status quo ante, which was its status as a ceasefire line. So what should our policy be in relation to the Shimla Agreement?
Well, I think this is an interesting issue with regard to what is the impact of India's unilateral measures on the Shimla Agreement. But I think it's probably deflecting us from the real issue, and the real issue is the implementation of the Security Council resolutions. The Shimla Agreement recognizes and says that the LOC is without prejudice to the positions of the two sides. The unilateral actions that India has taken, it took actions before. It occupied the Siachen Glacier, for example, after the Shimla Agreement, and it was, and we had lived with that situation. There have been these actions as such. So I think focusing only on the Shimla Agreement is probably deflecting us from the real issue.
I think the argument that AVM Shehzad Chaudhry was presenting is not that we move away from the actual issue, which obviously is the Kashmiris' right to self-determination under the UN SC resolution. What he was saying was, and I can ask him, he's right here, that these are steps that India is taking. And if India is unilaterally taking these steps, so they have a cumulative effect. They are also basically, by taking these steps, India is also saying that as far as we are concerned, there are no UNSC resolutions. This issue is settled. As a matter of fact, they have also done cartographic aggression, and they're now showing Azad Jammu and Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan as part of officially sanctioned Indian maps. So I think that does become an important issue, because it ultimately impacts negatively the broader issue of the Kashmiris' right to self-determination.
Yes, I accept all of that. I think that those are valid points. But my question is that for us now, just to focus and say we will denounce the Shimla Agreement, how does that advance our objective of securing self-determination for the Kashmiris or the implementation of the Security Council resolutions, which is the real issue? I think my advocacy is let's focus on the real issues and not get diverted into denouncing a Shimla Agreement or not denouncing it at this time. These are all issues that will have to be dealt with eventually in the resolution of the conflict. But our focus and our primary objective is to secure self-determination for the Kashmiri people, the legitimacy of their struggle for self-determination, the differentiation of that struggle from the Indian argument about terrorism. We have to expose Indian violations of the ceasefire. We have to expose the Indian actions within Kashmir against the civilian population, its high-handed policies, the political prisoners. It's got the thousands of young people that are still in jail, and the human rights violations that are taking place inside Jammu and Kashmir. Those should be our focus of attention, and that's where we have been focusing our diplomatic efforts.
Okay, let me go back to AVM Chaudhary. AVM Chaudhary, quickly, an explanation with reference to your point about the Shimla Agreement, and then we shall move to the terrorism in Balochistan, India's sponsorship of that, and also intelligence coming in about Indian military activity across the line of control.
Yeah, quickly. I mean, I would agree with Ambassador Akram if we were to resolve Kashmir at the Security Council or as per its regulations. Let's say if I were to take the matter to ICJ, International Court of Justice, and then ask them to adjudicate on it, perhaps they will, call these steps of the Indian government, not valid at all. And so that will be a good, strong point for Pakistan to win the argument as well as the case in the ICJ. That probably is not going to happen. Neither the Security Council has been able to resolve it, nor I assume that it may be able to. I hope it does, but likelihood is that it may not. Now, that's one point. The second is, if not that, then in 1972, both our countries agreed to sit together bilaterally and resolve the issue. And that has overshadowed the UNSC resolutions for a very long time. It's only recently that we've started to bring the resolutions back up again. But whether the resolutions or whether the Shimla Accord, neither of them has actually ever delivered any result. So third possibility, are you going to then decide on the inevitability of what has happened in a certain way, if we agree to that, or will a military conflict again sort of make us or help us decide that it is doable, feasible? Can we win the Kashmiris their right to plebiscite or freedom or whatever? Or are we going to live with what we have? So I know the answer is generally that let it stay on for another 70 years or 100 years. We've lived with it. But I think we are investing far too much of our effort and money and intellect in fighting a situation which is being forced onto us as a fait accompli.
Okay, so this imply that we need to do something other than taking the procedural route?
Yeah, if you're asking me, surely. I think the procedural route is something that we can sort of stick to. We have a representative there, and we have a case to keep reminding them either through letters of the foreign minister or obviously by the presence of the permanent rep there. But essentially, it hasn't delivered anything for the last, about 70 years or so. So we got to look at other options. And then we had agreed ourselves that, fine, no, we'll sit together and talk about it. I don't know when we have a government in India which is willing or ready to sit with the Pakistanis and begin to talk again on Kashmir. But there is a change of the nature of the problem. And that change in the nature of the problem has to be either acknowledged in Islamabad or Pakistan and begin to be looked anew in terms of the possible avenues of resolving it. It could be sitting together with India saying, well, let's live with what we have. Or for that matter, then we let matters take their route as they're taking and then see if we get into another conflict, another active war, and see where that takes us. So I really don't know what way are we going to choose, but if we let things drift, they will invariably lead to where they seem to be heading currently, and that is towards another showdown.
Here's the problem. I had the opportunity to meet with some very senior, Indian analysts, like former military officers, ambassadors, just before this COVID crisis and the lockdown, the rest of it. And many of these people were actually politically anti-BJP. But when I asked them if this could be reversed, if, let's say, another government were to come in and say, well, this is something that went against the spirit of Shimla, this is something that went against both the bilateral arrangements, other arrangements. There's also been a sleight of hand constitutionally in terms of, doing this. So let's reverse this. And everyone said, this is not going to be reversed. So to think that there's going to be another government that could possibly sit with Pakistan, surely, perhaps, but no government is likely to reverse what happened on August 5th. So I think that's a point that we'll have to sort of factor in. But before I wrap up this segment, Marshal Chaudhry, give me a sense of the attacks. There's been a spike of attacks in Balochistan, and there are also news about the military activity across the line of control. Is there a possibility, is there a serious possibility of some kind of ingress?
I think they have a list of options. I mean, they have charted a list of options. The first two, of course, are what is currently being played out. You see the high-handedness in Kashmir. We know in terms of the military suppression that is there and how people are being murdered, and the freedom fighters, the freedom fight is being suppressed. So we are aware of that. The second aspect of that is what I normally call the battle of reverse front, and which is from the bases in Afghanistan and Iran. The Indian intelligence forces continue to apply pressure on the rear of Pakistan in terms of forcing a battle of reverse front on it. So therefore, Pakistani military is divided in its attention across the Yellow Sea, what's happening there, and then, of course, what is happening in its rear. So those are the two possibilities. Now, if those two can sort of continue to keep the pressure off the Indian establishment about its own failures within, which is, of course, Kashmir, as well as the alienation of the Muslims within India, and thirdly, of course, currently the current crisis of COVID, and if the government seems to be failing there. And along with that, a fourth possibility is a momentum that no international force is there to check Modi's drive towards any of these 2 or 3 different excesses that he's practicing on his people, Kashmiris and the Muslims included. So when I look at that, I find that there could be a deliberate momentum established in terms of making a name, creating a legacy, doing something which Indira Gandhi did in 1971, and Mr. Modi leaving a name behind for that kind of a thing. That kind of silliness and stupidity is still possible. And so that's an area that Pakistan needs to look
so
into.
So we cannot afford to lower our guard. Thank you so much. That was Air Vice Marshal Shehzad Chaudhry. Thank you also to Ambassador Munir Akram for his insights from New York. We shall take a short break and return to discuss the fight against COVID-19, the pathogen that has brought global life to a near standstill. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. From the travails of Kashmir, we get to the ravages of COVID-19. As more information comes in about how the COVID-19 virus behaves, medical experts are realizing that the virus causes a far greater array of symptoms than was previously understood, and that its effects can be agonizingly prolonged. One such expert, Paul Garner, who was infected before the UK lockdown got in place, says of his illness, and I quote, "The virus is certainly causing lots of immunological changes in the body, lots of strange pathology that we don't yet understand. This is a novel disease and an outrageous one. The textbooks haven't been written," unquote. Experts also believe that a small but significant number of people are suffering from what they call the long tail form of the virus, reporting different symptoms almost every day: muggy head, upset stomach, tinnitus, pins and needles, breathlessness, dizziness, and arthritis in the hands, etc. At the same time, it seems to be doing almost nothing to some people who get infected without knowing and develop antibodies. This virus is weird as hell. How did the 1918 influenza virus behave? For that, we have to go back in history. To discuss the past and presents, we are joined by Dr. Yaqub Bangash, who is a historian of modern South Asia, and Professor Deria Unatmaz, who is an analyst, human immunologist at the Jackson Laboratory. Thank you to both panelists. Dr. Bangash, I hear that you've done some work in terms of how areas of Punjab were impacted during the 1918 pandemic. What are your findings?
And it's a very fascinating thing, because if you look at the history of epidemics in South Asia and especially Punjab that I've recently begun to look into, it comes up with very interesting patterns. And a lot of what we are suffering now in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have actually already gone through just over 100 years ago. And what's really fascinating is that just now, as you mentioned, that the symptoms are very different. So there were some places where people had a cold kind of a symptom and then sort of recovered, and it was no problem. There were other places in the Punjab where there were so many dead bodies on the streets, in the mortuaries, in the graveyards, that no one was able to clear them. So it had a very varied impact just in terms of one province. And if I can mention that a bit, that the influenza pandemic in 1918 and 19 came in three different waves. In the first wave, it actually affected between July and August. And in that, it had very mild reaction in the Punjab, and very few cases were actually reported, and not many people died. Then it had a lull period of a couple of months, and then it reappeared towards the end of September 1918, and then really picked up between the end of September, October, and the middle of November. So for about a 6-week period, there was literally havoc in the whole province. And if you read the Sanitary Commissioner's report on influenza, he actually notes that there was a time that the medical facilities were overwhelmed. A lot of doctors themselves were actually infected. Nearly 1 million people died in that 6-week period in the Punjab. But what's really fascinating is that the death rate, even though it actually more than doubled, so per million, the death rate in 1917 was 37.9, and it increased in 1918 to 81. So it actually more than doubled. But what's fascinating is that it had a varied impact in different districts of the Punjab. So for example, you had the district of Gurgaon, which is of course now in Haryana in India. In Gurgaon, the death rate was 155 per million, dramatically increased. But in other places, it was as low as 0. So Murray, for some interesting reason, did not report a death throughout 1918. And then if you just go beyond the Punjab, it was really fascinating that the rest of India also had varied different responses to the epidemic, and that again really showed the nature in which it affected people differently. So, for example, the highest number of dead people, percentage of dead people in India was in the central provinces, where the mortality rate was 202, and the lowest was in Bengal. Very interestingly, the most populous province actually, where in the Bengal presidency it was 38.7. So you could see that not just in one province, but in one country, there was such a huge variation, 2 or 3 times the number of variation. And that's exactly what we are seeing now between countries, between different regions. So it's kind of mirroring a lot of the epidemics we have had in the past, and especially in the Punjab and in the Pakistan area.
Okay, that's very interesting. Let me pull in Professor Deria Unatmaz on this. Professor Unatmaz, it seems that this pathogen is, after all, not so novel. I mean, if just like Dr. Yaqub Bangash said, with reference to the 1918 pandemic, there were regions that there were differences. Some regions were badly impacted, others were moderately impacted, some are almost not impacted. Similarly, death rates, and the rest of it. So, are there any similarities? Is there something that we can, or we learned from what happened then, and we could apply that knowledge to what's happening now? How do we go about this?
Sure. This is, of course, not the first pandemic that humanity is facing, but there are important differences between 1918 and the current pandemic. First of all, these are different viruses, even though they were both extremely infectious and deadly. This virus is particular, as you said also in the beginning of the program, that it's affecting many organs other than the lungs that the 1918 flu was causing pneumonia. This virus is causing other symptoms as well because it can infect different types of organs. Now, of course, there are two other major differences that the travel that we do today is much, much greater than 1918. So the speed at which the virus spread throughout the whole world, I mean, almost every region, was unprecedented. I mean, in a few weeks, a few months, we had virus everywhere. I think 1918 flu took a little bit of a longer period, and maybe that could also explain some of the differences between regions and mortalities back in 1918, as the previous speaker presented. Of course, the last, but maybe the most important difference is that we have extraordinary capabilities now that we didn't have 100 years ago in terms of testing, detecting. I mean, in 1918, we didn't even know what the virus was. People knew this was something contagious. They were wearing masks, but that was pretty much it. So we are not only able to test, but also track by sequencing the virus as it moves through the world. So we are on this back very, very closly. So yeah, definitely, I think the major lesson to take from 1918 is that if we don't use the tools that we have right now, or if we don't control this, it will end up being as deadly, if not more deadly, than 1918 flu.
Absolutely. So let me quickly go back to Bangesh here. Yaqub, before I let you go, since Professor Unutmaz talked about the travel and global connectivity, let me ask you a counterfactual. Would the 1918 pandemic have spread so much if there were no World War going on?
Oh, well, it's a difficult question to answer, but from what I've seen, the main reason for its great spread, at least in the subcontinent, in the Indian subcontinent, was the war, because a lot of people actually came back from the war, and it was the military, through the military, that it actually spread. And if you actually look at previous epidemics in India, also from cholera to the plague and even other diseases, a lot of them did spread through the military, because the military was actually going through different areas a lot of the time, even during peacetime. But what's very fascinating in the 1918 epidemic of influenza is that it was spread through the postal services also. So again, I think the great takeaway from 1918 is the focus on sanitation. What is very similar that I find about 1918, but even of the plague the plague epidemic in 1897 and elsewhere, is the fact that the focus is on sanitation. At that time, they also said, of course, they didn't use the word social distancing, but they said, don't meet many people, keep a distance, try to wear a mask, clean your hands, clean your body. So the focus on sanitation, I think, is key then and now.
It was key then, it's now. Thank you so much. That was Dr. Yaqub Bangesh speaking with us. Let me go back to Professor Unutmaz here. Professor Unutmaz, this long tail form that I mentioned in the opening, and there's a lot of literature coming out now on this, with symptoms differing every day, almost every day. Is this something that the experts are now looking into keenly?
Yes, definitely, and this is quite worrying as well. As the virus spreads, as more people get infected, a certain portion, because of their genetics or whatever other factors that we don't understand, present with either very different symptoms. For example, we're seeing these children who develop a very hyperinflammatory syndrome post-viral infection. We have actually 3 of those patients in our hospital, and there are over 150 in New York right now. The virus is gone, but we're seeing this symptoms in the kids. And there are some people who seem to persist the virus for months. And that's also worrying if they become infectious or not. And as you mentioned, there are a variety of symptoms that we're seeing. The blood clotting is a major problem. There are some young people who come to the hospital with stroke sometimes, and some of them might even die. And we also don't know what will happen post, this pandemic. In other words, when we have tens of millions of people who have been infected and recovered, what kind of damage that was done to their lungs or their other organs. So every week we're learning something new, and usually it's not a good news from the virus side.
Absolutely. Thank you. So that was Professor Daria Unutmaz speaking with us. I'm also joined by Dr. Patrick Tang, who is the Division Chief of Pathology Sciences at Sidra Medicine. Dr. Tang, thank you once again on this program. And once again, sadly, we're talking about the COVID-19 thing. I was, in my opening before you joined, I was talking about this new information seems to be coming in now. Experts are talking about the long tail form of this, patients that will face different symptoms almost every day, muggy head, tinnitus and pins and needles and, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole set of those symptoms. So this is something which, and I was just talking to Professor Daria Unutmaz, he said this is, of course, a matter of great concern for us because we're still trying to figure out why that is happening.
The majority of people still have the regular symptoms. So the majority of people still present with fever, respiratory symptoms. And I think many of the things that people it's being amplified in the media right now are all these rare symptoms and unusual symptoms that are sort of clouding the picture right now of what is going on. So the cases of inflammatory syndromes and other things like that are not really that common, but it's being talked about so much that people are now being misinformed and not really understanding anymore what the normal presentation of this disease is.
But Dr. Tang, this is literature that is coming out and which has the imprimatur of experts themselves in terms of blood clotting, for instance, or strokes, or intestinal and kidney problems and the rest of it. So it's not like a layperson like me putting something out. It's being put out by the experts themselves. But you're saying that these conditions are very rare, and the general issue still is with the respiratory system.
I think we're talking about different things. You are correct. So talking about the effects when people have severe infections, that is correct. It does affect other parts of the body because there are receptors for the virus in other organs in the body. So the issue is that, some of the other more rare symptoms are being amplified too much in the media.
So these other symptoms that we're talking about, these could be the result of comorbidities in the COVID-19 patients?
Some of them can be, but some are just individual differences in our genetics, individual differences in our immune systems, because we've heard a lot about people having, COVID toes and children having unusual inflammatory syndromes, things like this. So I think those things are interesting, and I think they make the public very concerned, but they're being talked about a lot more than they actually occur. Whereas, of course, we need to focus on the common presentations of the illness and, as we talked about earlier, some of the more common severe effects of the virus when people have a severe infection from it.
Okay, so initially it was about fever and the rest of it. But then the Journal of American Medical Sciences said that 70% of the affected patients that were ultimately hospitalized did not have fever. So So this is a strange, and people are talking about the fact that it's a weird kind of virus which is acting in strange ways.
I don't think it's that weird compared to other viruses. I think if you study any virus enough, you will find unusual presentations of the virus, or that the course in which it takes may not be that normal. There's a lot of variation in terms of the course before someone presents with a more severe presentation. So I think if we study any disease enough, you will find these variations.
Okay. Thank you so much. That was Dr. Patrick Tang speaking with us. This is all from Indus Special tonight. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. For latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.